So, late last year, a sex tape leaked online that showed the liberal streamer Destiny sucking off some guy. Allegedly, the guy in question is Destiny's fascist counterpart, Nick Fuentes. And this all surfaced sometime after Destiny's now ex-wife alleged that, while they were married, Destiny had sex with a different fascist YouTuber, Lauren Southern. Now, I don't know how far these rumors are actually true. I'm not the sort of person who normally cares all that much about the personal lives of internet celebrities, but what I think is interesting about this scandal, if you can call it that, is how indicative it is of wider political trends. This is one of the more prominent liberal political commentators out there, quite literally getting into bed with two different fascists on at least two non-consecutive occasions, and even performing fellatio on one of them. Again, allegedly. It's just such a perfect encapsulation of the reality that is liberals' relationship with fascism. For years, liberalism has pretended to be something distinct from fascism, an opposing force to it, but this past year, more than any other year that I've had the displeasure of living through, I feel like it's been more evident than ever that liberals and fascists are more alike than we give them credit for. 2024 was the year that I saw even the supposedly progressive liberals adopting the same xenophobic rhetoric as the fascists. And the people who voted for them apparently saw nothing wrong with this. These are the same people who spent the last 8 years pretending they were better than the Brexit voters, better than the Trump supporters. But of course, in the grand scheme of things, that sort of stuff is probably small potatoes compared to... The bombing began at the end of last year, but it steadily intensified this year, and Western liberals did nothing to stop it. Instead, they spend their times trying to suppress anti-genocide protesters, sometimes violently and brutally. Only in January of this year did they finally decide to stop the killing apparently, millions of ruined lives late, and with no assurances that a ceasefire will be permanent. The fact that these politicians were aiding and abetting a genocide also seemed not to shake a lot of their supporters. Any time you brought it up, they tried to shout you down.
I'm speaking.
The fact that liberals were so blasé about the whole thing, so dismissive of a very legitimate issue, it was eye-opening. I grew up with liberals really emphasizing how bad the Holocaust was, how important it was to remember it, very vocally saying how evil Holocaust deniers are, and saying things like, never again. But of course, all of that was clearly performative, because even though there's a fucking Holocaust being live streamed online for the whole world to see, these fuckers get angry when you suggest that they take a stand against it, saying it's too complicated for them to care about, or insisting there are bigger, more important issues for them to do nothing about instead. But Likud and the IOF aren't the only fascists the liberals have been supporting this year. They also seem to find time to mourn random far-right politicians like Navalny and even cry over Trump when he got shot at. It seems to me liberals like fascists and their policies more than they're letting on. And it's made me start to wonder how far liberals and fascists are really two meaningfully distinct groups. Numerous times in 2024, I found myself about to describe US President Biden and his vice president as fascists because of their actions, because of the genocide they were committed to supporting. A lot of people believed their lies about a ceasefire. Smarter people saw right through it. They've helped murder around 200,000 people in Palestine and Lebanon this past year, mostly children. And that's a conservative estimate. The bombs didn't stop, and when called out about it, they dismissed it and affirmed their support for the fascist Israeli regime. But I'm still hesitant to say liberals and fascists are one and the same. And is that just years of conditioning talking? The liberal propaganda that insists that they stand for freedom and rights and dignities? Because looking back on this year and with all the reading I also did this year, I think I've really started developing a different perspective on liberals and liberalism. I've understood liberalism and conservatism to be one and the same for a long time, two different tendencies of the same ideology, which we should just call liberalism. Liberalism, whether classical or reformist or any of the other strains they've developed, it's largely the same shit in different packaging. Sometimes the flavor is slightly different, sometimes that packaging is nicer, but the reality is it all serves the exact same interest, the perpetuation of the capitalist world order and bourgeois rule. Liberalism as a school of thought and historical movement is a lot broader than a lot of the more common narrow definitions floating around nowadays. Contemporary conservatism grew out of liberalism. Conservatism today is just support for an earlier form of liberalism. And their opponents, the parties and tendencies more typically referred to as liberal, as well as those called progressive or social democratic, are the reformist wing of liberalism. They're often confused as being left-wing in nature, but the reality is that these are liberal tendencies which co-opt socialistic language and socialistic policies, water them down and use them to bolster and reinforce capitalist rule rather than help upend it. So okay, if we're to accept conservatism as a tendency of liberalism, what does that make fascism? The line between conservatism and fascism is especially blurry. There's a lot of similar rhetoric. Hell, a lot of neo-fascists refer to themselves as ultra-conservative or just conservative a lot of the time. And we've seen how conservatives all line up behind Trump in the US. In the UK, people feel that the Conservative Party here has gone deeper into fascism, especially with their more direct targeting of marginalised groups. This isn't the first time people have wondered whether or not it would be more accurate to refer to the Tories as Nazis. During the election this year, people said, well, Starmer is bad, he's right-wing, but Sunak is a full-on fascist. And was that really true? And has Starmer really distinguished his government's policies from those of his predecessors? Hell, things are probably worse now, but of course the Conservative Party would have followed the exact same trajectory. Starmer has effectively maintained the same style of governance. So does that make Starmer a fascist too? Him and the other ghouls in his cabinet, like West Streeting? I don't think so. It's not that I like them any more than the Tories that were there before, but I think it just doesn't reflect the reality of the situation. I don't think the Conservative Party are fascists. I don't think the Labour Party are fascists either. I think they're two different shades of liberal, even if they wouldn't use that term for themselves. And the US Republican Party? Maybe that's a bit more complicated. I would be more comfortable describing Trump as a fascist along with a lot of the other grifters who have found their way into prominent positions within the party over the years, but I wouldn't then describe the US Republican Party as fascist, just fascist collaborators, which is common for conservatives and liberals of all stripes. And this past year has shown that liberalism has no issue with fascist policies, no issue with genocide, no issue with being staunchly anti-immigration, no issue with state violence against civilians, no issue with fascists. But of course, all of this isn't restricted to 2024. Over the past 12 months, I did a lot of reading. I focused a lot of attention on books about liberalism and counting liberal mythology. Books like Lasserdo's Liberalism, A Counter-History and Smith's Endless Holocausts have been eye-opening. Even if I suspected a lot of this already, having it all laid out like this, codified in one text, showing me how murderous and racist and destructive liberalism has been historically and still is today, before fascism really manifested as a movement in its own right, the liberals were doing all the exact same shit the fascists would do later. The genocides, the racial oppression, the authoritarianism. It has the facade of democracy and freedom and liberty and all those other tired buzzwords, but I think if you're actually on the left by now, you've accepted that all of that is fake. It's a lie. Is it just as bad as fascism though? I don't know. Maybe fascism can be looked at as essentially fast liberalism, liberalism done to an extreme degree, liberalism with its mask off, some form of liberalism that takes things a little bit further, what liberalism does when it's backed into a corner. The Marxist theorist Rajni Palmdar once described fascism as capitalism in decay. Michael Parenti suggested that fascism is the rational response of capitalism when faced with communism. So is that it? Is it just what happens when liberalism is exposed to pressure? Because if liberalism is the standard mode of bourgeois rule, and fascism is what the bourgeoisie do when in crisis, does that make fascism liberalism in its most extreme, violent form? Do we retroactively class all previous examples of liberal despotism as fascism? Because that's what I'm stuck on here. Because how do people characterize fascism? We talk about the authoritarianism, we talk about the genocide, we talk about the invasion and occupation of other countries. But again, these are all things that liberalism does as well. It serves the exact same class interests and it performs the exact same violence for those interests. So where's the difference? Is it all aesthetic? Is it vibes? Is it the fact that fascism often pretends to be anti-establishment? It's not that fascism never clashes with liberalism, it's a tenuous relationship. But maybe that is it. It's this weird fringe outsider politics aspect of fascism that distinguishes it. More than anything, what liberals don't like about Trump is that he doesn't play by the rules. They hate how uncouth he is, how he doesn't fit the mold of the typical establishmentist politician. Even if he's absolutely playing for the same team, this pseudo-radicalism that characterizes their rhetoric and some of the specific ways they conduct themselves, The outsider politics aspect of it all gives fascism a specific character when it's campaigning. They create a coalition of freaks and weirdos. A lot of the 21st century fascist ideology has its foundation in a internally contradictory composite of various internet conspiracy theories. And in the early 20th century, it was rooted in weird fringe pseudoscience, which even back then was being called into question. And then there's the class aspect, which in those early stages, it really draws in the classes that feel left behind, the middle income petty bourgeois types, the aristocrats and other old landed classes. But of course, ultimately it serves the big bourgeoisie, the big capitalists when it comes into power. There's a reason why JP Morgan and Henry Ford were lining up behind Hitler in the 20s and 30s, and there's a reason why Zuckerberg and Musk and Bezos are lining up behind Trump today. And that reason is that fascism is far more anti-reformist than liberalism is. Even your standard conservative parties will concede to reformism when they recognize it's the only way forward. Fascists have such an anger towards any and all socioeconomic reforms that will just throw them out without considering the value they actually bring in stabilizing capitalism. They look at social democracy and they call it communism, which is like looking at a butter knife and calling it a samurai sword. So where does that leave liberalism? Does it make it better than fascism? No, absolutely not. Does it make it worse? No, it's about even. They serve the exact same interests. They will work together before they work against each other on the working class's behalf. Both fascism and liberalism are antagonistic to the interests of the majority of humanity. That is to say that liberals and fascists are the enemies of the people. They are both violent and tyrannical. Neither has the moral high ground. One is designed to appeal to the fringes of society, but they both ultimately serve the exact same masters. The big difference is that one is bigoted 24/7 and the other will only show its true colors when it's pushed and then pretend like nothing happened or blame it on the other guy. They're two heads of the same beast and they have to be opposed together. That's what this past year has made me realize, and it's something I should have fully understood years ago. There is no world where the liberals are the lesser evil. There is no world where they are the friend of the working class. There is no world where they will give in to socialist demands, but of course they will always demand we capitulate to them and support their violence, their atrocities and their despotism. And that goes for the so-called progressives and social democrats too. They'll always side with genocide and imperialism over the working class. It was true of the German SPD, has been true of the British Labour Party, it's true of Bernie Sanders and others like him, and these fuckers will try to shame the real left, claim we're being unrealistic when these idiots are the ones who think that by siding with the enemies of humanity and capitulating to all their demands, they'll make some major advancement in social reform. It was a time when these types were a bit more militant and actually did make some significant strides. Nowadays, though, they've embraced neoliberalism fully and they're just a fucking joke. So that's the long and short of it. 2024, the year when liberals literally sucked off fascists and then tried to tell us to vote for them to stop fascism. And I, for one, am done giving liberals any benefit of the doubt.